A woman is about to be sold into slavery in the town square, and the only one who dares to speak up is the most fearsome gunman in the region. Will he come to save her, or just to buy another piece of merchandise? Before the final hammer blow, everything will change forever. Thank you for watching my channel. Follow the story to the end. Don't forget to like and leave a comment with the city you're watching from, so I know how far this story has traveled around the world. Now, let's begin. The dust hadn't settled in Cedar Hollow since sunrise, and already the square smelled like sweat and fear. They'd dragged a wooden platform out front of the feed store, the kind usually reserved for grain sacks and cattle pens, and they'd put Marin Ashcroft on top of it like she was something to be weighed. She stood with her wrists bound loosely in front of her, not because she'd fight. Everyone in town knew she couldn't, but because Silas Crane liked the look of it. He liked people watching a woman tied up like livestock. It reminded them all what he was capable of. "Now then," Crane said, strolling the platform's edge with his thumbs hooked into a vest that cost more than most men's houses. "We got ourselves a fine young woman here, hardworking, quiet, comes with a debt of $400 owed by her late father, God rest him, which I have legally assumed." A murmur went through the crowd. Nobody believed the number. Nobody said so. Marin kept her eyes on a crack in the platform wood. If she looked up, she'd see faces she'd known her whole life. Mrs. Holloway, who used to give her peppermint candy after church socials. Old Man Tibbs, who taught her father how to read a brand iron. And none of them would meet her eyes. That hurt worse than the rope on her wrists. "My father didn't owe you $400, she said, low, not for the crowd, just for Crane. He smiled without looking at her. "Your father owed me plenty, sweetheart. You just weren't around for the accounting." That was the lie of it. Her father had died 8 months back, thrown from a horse that everybody said had never thrown anybody before. Crane had shown up at the funeral with papers, signed papers. Marin had never seen her father's handwriting look so stiff, so careful, like somebody tracing letters they didn't fully know. She'd said as much once to Sheriff Daly. He'd looked at her with something like pity and something like warning, and told her some things were better left alone in a town like this. So she'd left it alone. And here she was anyway. "Do I have an opening bid?" Crane called out, spreading his arms like he was offering a prize calf. Silence. Real silence, the kind that has weight to it, not because nobody wanted to bid. 3 of Crane's men stood at the platform's corners, rifles loose in their hands, eyes flat. Everybody in Cedar Hollow knew exactly what happened to families who crossed Silas Crane. The Pruitts had lost their water rights inside a month. The Delgados had been run clean off land their grandfather cleared by hand. Bidding against Crane's will wasn't bidding. It was a death sentence with extra steps. So men who might have bid out of decency stood with their hats in their hands, jaws tight, saying nothing. $50, called one of Crane's own hired men, a formality, a number meant to set the floor for whatever Crane intended to pay himself, which was the real joke of this whole circus. He'd buy her and her debt and her labor for whatever he wanted, because nobody would top his own man's bid. "50 going once," Crane said, already grinning like a man certain of the punchline. Marin shut her eyes, thought about her father's hands, rough and broad, showing her how to splice a fence line. Thought about the ranch house standing empty now, locks changed, her belongings still inside somewhere behind doors that weren't hers to open anymore. 50 going twice. Hoofbeats, slow ones, unhurried. The kind of sound that didn't belong in a crowd holding its breath, because whoever was making it clearly hadn't gotten the message that everyone here was supposed to be afraid. Heads turned. Crane's smile faltered for just a second before he caught it and smoothed it back into place. A rider came down the main street at a walk, like he had all the time in creation. Tall in the saddle, hat pulled low enough to shade most of his face, a long coat dust pale from road miles. He didn't look left or right at the crowd. He looked at the platform. At her. Marin had never seen him before in her life, but half the men in that square had gone still in a different way now, not the cowed stillness of fear, but the wary stillness of recognition. Somebody near the front whispered a name like it cost him something to say it. Coulter Vance. She didn't know the name. She'd find out later that some did, and what they knew wasn't comforting. Stories about a man who'd cleared out a den of cattle thieves up near the territory line single-handed, who didn't talk much and didn't need to because his reputation talked for him. A man people moved out of the way for, the same way they'd move for a storm front. He reined up at the edge of the crowd, not dismounting, and for a long moment he just looked at the platform, at Crane, at the rifles in the hands of Crane's men, like he was doing arithmetic nobody else could see. "Something I can help you with, stranger?" Crane called out, recovering his showman's voice, though it had an edge in it now. "Heard there's an auction," Coulter said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The whole square had gone quiet enough to hear a held breath. "Didn't realize you were selling people in this town." "We're settling a debt," Crane said, "lawfully." "Funny how lawfully always seems to land in your favor, Crane." Coulter finally swung down off the horse. Slow, no sudden moves, his coat falling open enough that Marin caught the dull gleam of a gun belt, but nothing more threatening than that. He didn't reach for it. He just walked, easy as Sunday, right up to the edge of the platform. 400, was it? Crane's eyes narrowed. "You looking to bid, mister, or you looking to make trouble?" "I'm looking," Coulter said, "to buy something I intend to keep." A ripple went through the crowd, surprise, confusion, something almost like hope nobody quite dared to hold on to yet. $1,000, Coulter said. The number landed like a gunshot. Crane's mouth actually opened before he caught himself. $1,000 was more than that platform, that feed store, and half the buildings on the street put together were worth in most men's eyes. It was an amount meant to end an auction, not continue one. It was an amount that said plainly, "I will not be outbid, and we both know it." "That's," Crane started. "Cash," Coulter added, like an afterthought, reaching into his coat and producing a leather wallet thick enough that even from the platform Marin could see it wasn't bluster. He didn't hand it over yet. He just held it where Crane and everyone else could see it was real. For the first time since she'd been led up onto that platform, Marin saw something close to uncertainty pass over Silas Crane's face. This wasn't part of his arithmetic. He'd built this whole performance assuming nobody would dare top his own bid, that fear would do the work intimidation always did in this town. He hadn't planned for a stranger who clearly didn't care what Crane was capable of, or who simply didn't believe Crane was capable of doing it to him. "You don't know what you're buying into," Crane said, low now, the showman's tone gone, something colder underneath it. "Then I guess we'll both find out," Coulter said. He looked up at the platform then, at her, and for the first time Marin saw his face clear under the brim of his hat, weathered, scarred faintly along one cheekbone, eyes the gray of a sky before rain. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't performing for the crowd the way Crane had been. He just looked at her like she was a person, which after months of being looked at like an account ledger, nearly undid her on the spot. "Going once," he said, not to Crane, but to the crowd, in the flat cadence of a man finishing what Crane had started. "Going twice." Nobody moved. "Sold," Coulter said. "To me." Crane's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. His men shifted, rifles still loose, but their eyes flicking to him for instruction he wasn't giving yet, because even Crane understood that gunning down a man in front of half the town over a legal auction he himself had announced would be a different kind of problem than the kind he usually solved with intimidation. Witnesses were witnesses. Even bought sheriffs had limits to what they could bury. "Fine," Crane said finally, forcing the word out like it tasted wrong. "Fine. A deal's a deal." He snatched the wallet from Coulter's outstretched hand, counted it with sharp, angry motions, and shoved a hastily scrawled receipt at him. "She's yours then. Debt cleared. Don't come crying to me when you find out what you bought." "I didn't buy anything," Coulter said, and his voice carried now, clear enough for the whole square to hear, clear enough that Mrs. Holloway and Old Man Tibbs and Sheriff Daly, standing useless at the edge of the crowd, all heard it too. "Far as I'm concerned, nobody bought anybody here today. I just made sure a debt got paid so a man like you didn't have an excuse to own a person who isn't for sale. She's free. Not mine. Free." The crowd didn't quite know what to do with that. A few men exchanged glances. Somewhere near the back, somebody actually started to clap. A single pair of hands before going quiet again, embarrassed or afraid or both. Coulter climbed the 2 steps up onto the platform and, without asking, drew a knife from his belt and cut the rope at her wrists, quick and careful, like he'd done it before, and knew exactly how not to nick skin. "You don't have to come with me," he said quietly, "just for her. I paid the debt because nobody else in this square was going to. What you do next is your business." Marin looked down at her raw wrists, then out at the crowd, at faces that had watched her get auctioned like cattle and said nothing, at Sheriff Daly, who still hadn't moved a single step toward the platform, at Silas Crane counting his money with murder simmering behind his eyes. She looked back at Coulter Vance. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said. "Everywhere else is owned by him." Something shifted in his expression then. Not pity. She'd had enough of pity to last a lifetime. Something closer to understanding, like he knew exactly what it meant to have nowhere that wasn't somebody else's territory. "Then you'll stay with me until that's not true anymore," he said. "And I intend to make sure it stops being true." He helped her down off the platform, and the crowd parted the way crowds do for things they don't understand yet but sense the shape of, the beginning of something, maybe, though nobody in Cedar Hollow could have said exactly what. Crane watched them go, his receipt book still open in his hands, his men still flanking him with their rifles, and something in his face had changed from irritation into a colder, more patient kind of fury. A man like Crane didn't lose. He recalculated. "Get word to the others," he said quietly to the man nearest him, once Coulter and Marin had crossed out of easy earshot. "Find out everything there is to know about Coulter Vance, everything, and get the boys ready. This isn't finished." The man nodded and slipped off through the dispersing crowd. Marin didn't hear any of it. She was too busy walking beside a stranger she'd known for less than 10 minutes, toward a horse, toward a direction she hadn't chosen, but that felt for the first time in 8 months like it might actually be hers. They reached his horse, a rangy bay gelding that eyed her with the same flat suspicion its owner had shown Crane, and Coulter swung up easily before reaching a hand down. "You ride?" "Not well," she admitted. "My father always meant to teach me proper. Never got the chance." "Then I'll teach you," he said, like it was the simplest thing in the world, like teaching a woman he'd known 10 minutes to ride a horse was just the next obvious item on a list only he could see. Among other things. She took his hand and let him pull her up behind him, and as Cedar Hollow's main street rolled away beneath the gelding's hooves, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to breathe. Behind them, Silas Crane stood in the dust of the square he'd built his reputation on, watching the only public defeat he'd suffered in 15 years ride off toward the horizon, and already, in the cold calculating part of his mind that had built an empire on other people's misfortune, he was deciding exactly how Coulter Vance was going to die for it. They rode in silence for the first mile, the town shrinking behind them into a smear of rooftops and dust. "Why?" Marin finally asked, because the question had been sitting in her chest since the platform, heavier than the morning's fear had been. "You don't know me. You don't owe Cedar Hollow a thing. Why spend $1,000 on a stranger?" Coulter was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. When he did, his voice had a rougher edge to it, something old and worn smooth like river stone. "Had a sister once," he said. "Different town, different man, same kind of arithmetic. Nobody stepped in for her. I was 3 states away working a cattle drive when it happened, and by the time I rode back..." He stopped, started again. "There wasn't anything left to step in for." Marin didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. The shape of it was there in the silence after, in the careful, deliberate way he held himself, like a man who'd built an entire life around making sure he was never 3 states away again. "I'm sorry," she said. "Wasn't your doing." He shifted in the saddle, glancing back at her for just a second. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel beholden. I'm telling you so you understand I'm not doing this out of charity, and I'm not doing it because I think you need rescuing. I'm doing it because men like Crane only exist because enough people decide it's safer to look away. I got tired of being one of those people a long time ago." "He's not going to let this go," Marin said. "You embarrassed him in front of the whole town. He'll come for both of us." "I know." "You don't seem worried." "I am worried," Coulter said, and there was something almost wry in it, the first hint of humor she'd heard from him. "I'm just better at not showing it than most men. Comes in useful." They rode on, the prairie opening wide in gold around them, and Marin found herself studying the back of this stranger's coat, the set of his shoulders, trying to make sense of a man who'd ridden into the worst day of her life and simply refused to let it end the way everyone, including her, had assumed it would. "Where are we going?" she asked. "My place. Small spread, about 2 hours out, nothing fancy. Nobody knows it's mine except a couple of people I trust, which right now is more valuable than you might think." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend this ends today, Marin. Crane's not the kind of man who loses quiet, but you're not going back on that platform. Not while I'm breathing. She believed him. That surprised her more than anything else that had happened that whole strange, terrible, unexpectedly hopeful day, that after 8 months of believing nobody, she'd found, in the space of 10 minutes, a stranger she somehow already trusted with her life. Behind them, miles back in Cedar Hollow, Silas Crane was already writing letters to men who owed him favors, to men with guns for hire and no particular loyalty to the law, to a town official or two who understood exactly which side their bread was buttered on. The auction was over. The war hadn't even started yet. The small spread Coulter called home sat tucked into a fold of land that didn't show itself until you were nearly on top of it. A low ranch house, a barn that had seen better decades, a corral with 2 horses besides his own. Smoke curled from a chimney that hadn't been lit in what looked like weeks. "Not much," he said, swinging down and reaching up to help her off the gelding. "But Crane doesn't know about it, and that's worth more than any porch swing." Marin's legs nearly buckled when her boots hit the ground. 2 hours of riding catching up with muscles that hadn't done that kind of work since she was a girl. Coulter caught her elbow without comment, steadied her, let go the second she found her footing again. "First lesson," he said. "Riding's easier on the body than walking, until it isn't. Give it a day, you'll be sore in places you didn't know could be sore." Is that supposed to be encouraging? It's supposed to be honest. I figure you've had enough people telling you pretty lies today. That landed harder than she expected, and she looked away toward the house, toward anything that wasn't his face seeing too much of hers. Inside, the place was sparse but clean, a man's house built for function, not comfort. A rifle over the mantel, a single chair pulled close to the stove. Marin stood in the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed to take up space in it. "You can sit," Coulter said, already moving to get a fire going. "Nobody's auctioning you in here." She sat. Watched him work. The easy competence of a man who'd lived alone long enough to do everything without thinking about it. After a while, he handed her a tin cup of coffee, bitter and strong, and dropped into the chair across from her like his bones had finally remembered how tired they were. "I need you to understand something," he said. "What happened today, in that square, Crane's not going to sit with that. Man like him, his whole power is built on people being too scared to test him. I tested him in front of half the town, and he lost. He can't let that stand." "So what happens now?" "Now we find out exactly how deep his rot goes, and we make sure everybody else finds out too." Coulter turned the cup in his hands. "I've heard things, riding through these parts the last year. Ranches that changed hands sudden-like, right after the owner died or disappeared or just packed up overnight, scared half to death. Always Crane's name attached, one way or another. Always some debt nobody could quite explain. Like my father's. Like your father's." He held her eyes. "Marin, I don't think your father owed Crane a cent." She'd suspected it for months, in the part of herself she hadn't let speak too loud, because speaking it loud meant accepting that her father hadn't just died in an accident, that something had been done to him, and to her, on purpose, by a man with enough money to make truth disappear. "Then prove it," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Don't just tell me what you suspect, help me prove it." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or something like respect. "That's not a small thing you're asking." "You bought my freedom for $1,000 in front of the whole town," she said. "I don't think you're a man who does small things." He almost smiled at that. Almost. "All right," he said, "then we start tomorrow. But you should know, if we do this, really do this, there's no riding away from it halfway through. Crane will come at us with everything he's got. Bounty men, hired guns. Maybe even the law, if Daly's bought as deep as I think he is. You sure that's a road you want to walk?" Marin thought about the platform, the rope on her wrists, the faces in the crowd that wouldn't look at her. "I've been standing still my whole life watching things happen to me," she said. "I'd rather walk into something than keep standing still and waiting for the next bad thing to find me." Coulter studied her for a long moment, like he was recalculating something about her, the way he must have recalculated Crane back in the square. "All right," he said again, quieter this time. "Then we'll need to teach you a few things first. Can't fight a war standing still, like you said. You'll need to know how to ride proper, how to shoot if it comes to that, how to read a man's intentions before he acts on them. I won't always be standing next to you." "You think I can't learn?" "I think you've never had the chance to find out what you can learn," he said. That's different. Chum. The next 3 weeks reshaped Marin Ashcroft in ways she wouldn't have believed possible standing on that auction platform. Mornings started before sunrise, Coulter walking her through the basics of sitting a horse properly, then trotting, then the long, bruising work of actually controlling an animal instead of just surviving its movement. She fell more times than she could count. The first few times he helped her up. By the second week, he just waited, arms crossed, until she got up herself. That's not cruelty, he told her, the third time she glared at him from the dirt. That's the only way you learn it sticks. Nobody on a battlefield's going to wait for you to feel ready. You make it sound like we're going to war. We are, he said simply. Just not the kind with uniforms. Afternoons were for the rifle, an old Winchester he kept oiled and ready, that he handed her with more ceremony than she expected from a man so plain-spoken about everything else. This isn't about turning you into a gunfighter, he said, showing her how to brace it against her shoulder. It's about making sure you're never standing in front of a man with a weapon and nothing in your hands but fear. Even if you never fire a shot at another person in your life, I want you to know you could if it came down to it. That knowledge changes how a person carries themselves. She missed the target more than she hit it those first days. But there was something in the weight of the rifle, the recoil against her shoulder, that began to loosen something tight in her chest that had been wound since the funeral. Since long before the funeral, if she was honest. Since the years of watching her father grow quieter and more worried without ever telling her why. Evenings, they talked. Not about feelings, not at first. Coulter wasn't a man who reached easily for that kind of conversation. But about Crane. About the ranches. About the names Coulter had collected over a year of quiet writing and quieter listening. The Pruitt family, run off their water rights inside a month of refusing to sell. The Delgado spread, fenced off and seized after a fire nobody could explain, burned their barn to the ground. A dozen others scattered across 3 counties, all following the same pattern: debt, intimidation, sudden ownership change, and always, somewhere in the paperwork, Silas Crane's name. He's not just greedy, Marin said one night, staring into the fire. He's organized. This isn't one man grabbing land when he can. This is a system. That's what scares me about him, Coulter admitted. A greedy man, you can outlast. A man running a system, you have to break the system, or it just keeps eating people long after he's gone. Then that's what we do, she said. We don't just save my ranch, we break the whole thing. He looked at her for a long moment, firelight catching the gray of his eyes. And for the first time she saw something in his face that wasn't caution or calculation. Something that looked almost like hope. The rare, careful kind that men like him didn't let themselves feel often. 3 weeks ago, you were standing on a platform letting a man decide your whole life, he said. Now you're talking about bringing down an empire. 3 weeks ago, I didn't know I had a choice, she said. You gave me one. I intend to use it. The first attack came on a Tuesday, 11 days after the auction, while Coulter was teaching her how to splint a wound using strips torn from a shirt. Practical knowledge, he said, for a war fought far from any doctor. The gelding screamed before either of them heard the riders. Coulter was up and moving before Marin had fully registered the sound, rifle in hand, shoving her toward the side of the barn with a hand against her shoulder. Stay low. Stay behind the water trough. Don't come out unless I call you. Coulter. Marin. His voice had gone flat, focused, a different man than the one who'd spent 3 weeks patiently correcting her grip on a rifle stock. Trust me. She did. She hated herself a little for how easily she did, but she pressed herself behind the stone trough and watched 4 riders come up the trail at a hard gallop, dust boiling behind them, rifles already drawn. Coulter didn't run for cover. He stood in the open yard, rifle braced, and waited until they were close enough that missing wasn't an option. And then he put a round into the lead rider's shoulder with a precision that told Marin everything about why men in Cedar Hollow had gone quiet at the sound of his name. The rider went down hard. The other 3 scattered, firing wild, and Coulter dropped behind the water trough beside her, breathing hard, reloading with hands that didn't shake despite the chaos. Crane's men? She asked. Crane's money, he said. Probably hired out of the territory line, men who don't know us, don't care who's right, just know somebody's paying for trouble. He peered over the trough's edge, then ducked back as a shot chipped stone inches from his head. There's 3 more of them than I'd like. A bullet whined past, close enough that Marin felt the air move. Her whole body wanted to fold in on itself. The old instinct, the auction platform instinct, to make herself small and hope it passed her by. She didn't let it. She reached for the second rifle Coulter had set against the trough that morning, the one he'd been teaching her to load that very afternoon, like some part of him had known they'd need it sooner than either of them wanted to admit. And she brought it up the way he'd shown her. Brace against the shoulder, breathe out slow, find the front sight. "Marin, what are you—" "You said I should know I could," she said, and fired. She didn't hit anyone. The shot went wide, kicking dirt up 10 feet from the nearest rider, but it was enough. Enough noise, enough surprise, enough proof that the woman behind the trough wasn't unarmed, that the man flinched his horse sideways, breaking his angle, giving Coulter the half-second he needed to put him down with a shot to the leg. The last two riders, seeing two of their own bleeding in the dirt and a target that was apparently armed and willing to shoot back, didn't stay to find out if their luck held. They wheeled their horses and rode hard for the horizon, leaving their wounded behind in the dust. Silence came back into the yard slow, the way it does after gunfire, ringing and strange. Marin's hands were shaking now that there was nothing left to aim at. Coulter rose slowly, rifle still ready, watching the horizon until he was satisfied the riders weren't circling back. "You weren't supposed to come out," he said, "but there wasn't much heat in it." "I wasn't hiding," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment, dust on her face, hands trembling, rifle still gripped white-knuckled in her fingers, and something shifted in his expression that she didn't have a name for yet. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose there is." They tied the two wounded riders and left them for the territory marshal 3 towns over to deal with. Men who'd talk, Coulter said, once they understood Crane wasn't going to ride to their rescue. "This is just the start," he told her that night, both of them too keyed up from the fight to sleep, sitting instead on the porch steps watching a sky thick with stars. Neither of them in that moment had the peace of mind to admire. "He knows where we are now. Knows we're not running. Next time, he won't send 4 men he barely knows. He'll send people who actually want us dead. Then we stop waiting for next time," Marin said. "You said yourself we have to break the system, not just survive it. So let's find the proof. The forged papers, the other families. Let's build something Crane can't shoot his way out of." Coulter was quiet for a while, turning that over. "There's a man 2 counties over," he finally said. "Used to be Crane's bookkeeper years back before he had a crisis of conscience or got greedy and wanted more than Crane was paying him. Stories differ on which. He disappeared from Crane's operation under circumstances nobody talks about straight. If anybody's got copies of the real records, the ones before Crane's people redrew them, it's him. If we can find him, then that's where we go. It's dangerous, more dangerous than out here. We'd be moving through towns where Crane's got eyes. More dangerous than 4 men with rifles riding up on us at breakfast?" That actually got a real smile out of him, brief and surprised, like his face wasn't entirely used to the shape of it. "Fair point." They left 2 days later, riding north and east, Marin handling her own horse now with a competence that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. The towns they passed through carried the same undercurrent she remembered from Cedar Hollow, a watchfulness, a carefulness in how people spoke. Like everyone had learned the cost of saying the wrong thing within earshot of the wrong person. The bookkeeper's name, when they finally tracked down someone willing to whisper it, was Ezra Whitcomb, and he was harder to find than his name suggested he should be, a man who'd built a small, quiet life under a different surname, in a town just large enough to disappear into. "Why would I talk to you?" he said, when Coulter finally cornered him outside a feed store, voice low, eyes darting for an exit that wasn't there. "Crane's people have been looking for me on and off for 2 years. You think I want to paint a target on myself talking to strangers?" "Because Crane's already painted targets on a dozen families who never did anything but exist on land he wanted," Marin said, stepping forward before Coulter could answer. "My father's one of them. He's dead now, and Crane's still calling it a debt he made up out of thin air. I don't care what reasons you had for leaving. I care whether you've still got the conscience that made you leave in the first place." Whitcomb looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. Fear, certainly, but something else too. Old guilt, maybe, the kind that doesn't fully wash off even years in a new name later. "I kept copies," he finally said, voice barely above a whisper. "Before I left, the real ledgers, the ones before his lawyer started redrawing debts that never existed. I told myself it was insurance in case he ever came for me directly. Never thought I'd hand them over willing. What changed your mind? Coulter asked. Whitcomb looked at Marin, at the rifle she now carried without flinching, at the steadiness that hadn't been there a month ago and had been bought with bruises and bullets and 100 small moments of choosing not to fold. You remind me of my daughter, he said quietly. She'd have done the same thing, stood up instead of running. I ran instead. Maybe it's time I stopped. He led them to a small, false-bottomed trunk hidden beneath floorboards in his modest house, and pulled out a stack of ledgers, real ones, with handwriting that didn't waver the careful, forged way Marin's father's signature had on Crane's paperwork. Names, dates, real debts, real numbers, and beside them, the false figures Crane's people had substituted to justify seizing land that had never truly owed him anything. It was the first solid proof either of them had held in their hands. This is enough, Coulter said, flipping through pages with the focus of a man finally seeing the shape of the war he was fighting. This is enough to bring him down, if we can get it in front of the right people, in front of enough witnesses that he can't just burn it and bury us alongside it. The livestock auction, Whitcomb said suddenly. Biggest one of the year, every rancher in 3 counties attends, along with half the territorial officials Crane keeps in his pocket, and a few who aren't bought yet, who'd have to act if the proof was shoved in front of them publicly enough that looking away wasn't an option. Marin felt something settle into place in her chest, cold and clear and certain. Then that's where we finish this, she said. Coulter looked at her, at the ledgers in his hands, at the woman standing beside him who'd walked onto an auction platform as property and was now planning to walk into the heart of her enemy's empire and burn it down with nothing but paper and nerve. You understand what you're proposing, he said. Walking into the middle of his territory surrounded by his men, in front of everyone he's ever bought or threatened into silence. I understand, Marin said, that hiding hasn't worked, and running hasn't worked, and the only thing Crane's never had to face is the truth, standing right in front of him, where everybody can see it at the same time he does. Coulter closed the ledger slowly, something hard and resolved settling into his expression. Then we'd better make sure we walk in ready, he said. Because once we start this, there's no backing out. We end it there, in front of everyone, or he ends us quiet, somewhere nobody's watching. I'd rather take that chance standing up, Marin said, than spend the rest of my life standing still. Outside Whitcomb's small house, the sun was sliding low and orange across a sky that gave no hint of the storm gathering beneath it. A storm built not of weather, but of forged signatures and stolen land and a woman who'd been sold once and intended to make absolutely certain it never happened to anyone else again. They spent the better part of a week planning, holed up in a rented room above a saddlery in a town far enough from Crane's reach that nobody recognized either of their faces. Whitcomb stayed with them, nerves fraying a little more each day, jumping at every footstep on the stairs outside. He'd lived 2 years building a quiet life under a false name, and now he was preparing to stand it all back up in front of the man he'd run from. You don't have to come to the auction yourself, Coulter told him, the night before they planned to ride out. Just having your ledgers is enough. You don't need to put your face in front of Crane again. Yes, I do, Whitcomb said, and his voice shook even as the words came out steady underneath it. Records on a table a stranger can call forged. Records and the man who kept them, standing there saying I wrote this, I watched him change it. That's harder to wave away. I ran once. I'm not interested in running for the rest of my life waiting for him to find me anyway. Marin understood that better than either man in the room probably realized. She'd spent 8 months running too, in her own way, running from the truth about her father, running from what Crane really was, running from the fact that nobody in Cedar Hollow was coming to save her unless she stopped waiting for it. All right, Coulter said. Then we go in together. But we do this smart. Crane's not going to let an auction this size go unguarded. Not with everything riding on his reputation right now. He knows what we did to those 4 men he sent. He'll have more eyes on that auction grounds than usual. How many men does he usually bring to something like this? Marin asked. Normally? A handful. Enough to look respectable. Coulter's jaw tightened. After what happened at the ranch, I'd guess he doubles it, maybe triples. We won't be able to fight our way in if it comes to that. We need the crowd itself working for us before any gun comes out of its holster. Then we don't give him the chance to control the moment, Marin said slowly, an idea taking shape as she spoke it. He likes spectacle. He likes an audience watching him win, We use that. We don't sneak the ledgers to some lawman in a back room where Crane can make them disappear before any one official even reads them. We do it in front of everyone, all at once, where he can't stop it without 300 witnesses watching him try. Coulter looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, pride maybe, mixed with the particular fear of a man who'd grown to care about someone walking willingly toward danger. That's either the smartest plan I've heard, he said, or the most reckless, possibly both. Most good plans are, Marin said, and the corner of her mouth tugged up despite the weight sitting in her chest. You taught me that, or something close to it. The Larkspur County Livestock Auction was, by all accounts, the largest gathering of its kind for 100 miles in any direction. Ranchers from 3 counties, cattle buyers from as far as the rail towns, territorial officials looking to be seen shaking the right hands, and at the center of it all, presiding like a king holding court, Silas Crane. He'd built a reputation here over a decade, buying goodwill with charity to the church building fund and the schoolhouse repairs, smiling for every photograph, shaking every hand that mattered. The auction ground sprawled across open pasture just outside Larkspur proper. Pens of cattle, a central platform for the bidding itself, rows of wagons and buggies, and enough people milling between them that finding any single face in the crowd would normally be next to impossible, which was exactly what Marin and Coulter were counting on. They arrived separately, 2 days before the event, blending into the swelling crowd of ranchers and traders setting up camp on the ground's edges. Whitcomb came in a day later, disguised under a wide-brimmed hat and a beard he hadn't worn in 2 years, carrying the ledgers wrapped tight in oilcloth inside a saddlebag he never let out of arm's reach. You're sure about this? Coulter said to Marin the morning of the auction, both of them crouched behind a wagon at the edge of the grounds, watching Crane's men. And there were more of them now, just as he'd predicted, scattered through the crowd in 2s and 3s, trying and mostly failing to look casual. I've never been more sure of anything, Marin said. Her hands weren't shaking. She noticed that distantly, with a kind of wonder, that the same hands that had trembled holding a rifle for the first time a month ago were steady now, steady the way they'd needed to be all along and just hadn't had the chance to learn it. If this goes wrong, then it goes wrong with both of us trying, she said, cutting him off gently. I'd rather that than spend my life wondering what would have happened if I'd let you do this alone. Or worse, if I'd let Crane keep winning because nobody was willing to risk being wrong in public. Coulter reached out, just briefly, and squeezed her hand. Not a romantic gesture exactly. Not yet, but something that carried weight all the same. A promise neither of them said out loud. All right, he said. Let's finish this. The bidding had been running for nearly 2 hours when Marin made her way through the crowd toward the central platform, Whitcomb a few steps behind her, the ledgers no longer hidden but carried openly now in his arms like he'd finally decided hiding them had cost him enough years already. Crane stood near the platform's edge, deep in conversation with a territorial judge Marin recognized from the courthouse steps back in Cedar Hollow. A man whose presence here was no accident, she realized. Crane liked his witnesses curated. He liked an audience that already owed him something. She climbed the platform steps before anyone thought to stop her, and for a moment the crowd's attention, drawn by the unfamiliar sight of a woman walking up uninvited during a cattle bid, shifted toward her in a wave of confused murmurs. Excuse me, the auctioneer started. Miss, this isn't... I have something everyone here needs to see, Marin said, and her voice, though it shook at the very edges, carried clear across the gathered crowd. Something about how a number of you came to own land that used to belong to other families. Families who are gone now, or run off, because of debts that were never real. The murmur turned into something sharper. Crane's head snapped toward the platform, his face going through a fast, ugly transformation. Surprise, recognition, and then a cold fury he fought visibly to smother back into his usual public calm. This is a livestock auction, he called out, voice pitched to carry, pitched to sound reasonable, even as his eyes promised something else entirely. Whatever grievance this woman has, this isn't the place. It's exactly the place, Marin said. Because everyone who's ever been afraid to ask you a hard question in private is standing right here, all together, and for once you can't make any of us disappear one at a time. Whitcomb stepped up beside her on the platform, ledgers held out for the crowd to see, hands steadier than Marin expected from a man who'd spent 2 years running from this exact moment. My name is Ezra Whitcomb, he said loud enough that even the ranchers near the cattle pens turned to listen. I kept Silas Crane's books for 6 years. These are the originals, the real debts, the real numbers, before his lawyer redrew them into something that justified taking land that was never owed to him in the first place. A rancher near the front, a heavy-set man Marin didn't recognize, pushed forward, face dark with something that looked uncomfortably close to recognition. That's my brother's signature on the top page. He sold his spread to Crane 2 years back, said he owed some debt from his father's time, said he didn't have a choice. He didn't, Whitcomb said quietly. Not the way Crane explained it to him. The crowd's noise swelled, voices overlapping, confusion curdling fast into something angrier. Crane stepped up onto the platform himself now, his composure cracking at the edges, his men beginning to drift closer through the crowd with the particular tension of hired muscle waiting on a signal. These are forgeries, Crane said, loud, reaching for the ledgers Whitcomb held just out of his grasp. This man is a disgraced former employee with a grudge, making up stories to extort. Then let the judge compare the handwriting, Marin said, cutting through him. Let anyone here compare the signature on these pages to the one on my father's so-called debt. You'll find his is shaking, careful, traced like a man copying letters he barely knew the shape of. My father's actual signature is in the church record book from the Harvest Festival, signed not 3 weeks before he died. Anybody here who attended can vouch for what it looks like. She watched the judge near the platform's edge go very still, his earlier easy posture stiffening into something far more wary, the careful neutrality of a man suddenly aware he was being watched by 300 people instead of conducting business quietly with a benefactor. This is slander, Crane snapped, but his voice had lost its earlier command. Get them off this platform. He turned toward his men, the signal finally given, and Marin felt her stomach drop as 3 of them began pushing through the crowd toward the platform steps, hands moving toward holsters. Coulter came out of the crowd before they reached the steps. He didn't draw first. He'd told her that, back at the ranch, I won't be the one who fires first in front of witnesses. That's exactly the trap a man like Crane wants me to fall into. But he put himself bodily between the approaching gunman and the platform steps, hand resting near his own holster, voice carrying flat and clear. Touch either of them, he said, and every person here watches it happen. You really want that on you in front of 300 witnesses and a territorial judge? The gunman hesitated, eyes flicking to Crane for instruction. It was the hesitation that did it, the visible, public moment of men deciding whether to commit murder in front of an audience that included a man with legal authority. One of Crane's hired men actually backed half a step, and that single crack in the unified front was enough. He's bluffing, Crane snarled. Shoot him if you have to, I'll handle the… Crane! The voice came from the crowd itself this time, a rancher, older, weathered, a man Marin didn't know, but whose face carried the particular hardness of someone who'd just watched his suspicions confirmed in public. My cousin lost his ranch to you 3 years back. Same story. Debt nobody could explain, signature that didn't look right, and when he tried to fight it, your boys ran his cattle off a ridge in the middle of the night and called it an accident. That's not… Crane started. I'm not finished, the rancher said, and something in his tone made even Crane's remaining composure falter. I didn't say anything back then because I was scared what happened to my own place if I did. Watching this happen here, today, in front of everybody, I'm done being scared. More voices rose now, scattered through the crowd, each one a small admission that had been sitting unspoken for years. A story about a forged signature, a sudden fire, a debt that never made sense, a family that left town overnight and never explained why. It came in pieces, overlapping, messy, the way truth usually surfaces when it's been buried under fear for a long time. But it came. And Crane stood on the platform watching the foundation of everything he'd built crack open in real time in front of the very people he'd spent a decade cultivating as witnesses to his generosity. Arrest them, Crane shouted at his men, voice cracking now, with something closer to desperation than command. Arrest the lot of them. I don't care what it costs. That was when his own men finally broke. One of them, a broad-shouldered man Marin recognized vaguely from the earlier attack at the ranch, the leader of that first failed raid, lowered his rifle entirely and stepped back from the platform. I signed on for ranch work and debt collection, he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Nobody told me half the debts I was collecting on were made up. I'm not shooting an unarmed man and woman in front of a judge to cover for that. Another of Crane's men followed suit, and then a third, the careful unity of hired muscle dissolving the moment it became clear that protecting Crane now meant standing publicly accused alongside him rather than simply collecting a paycheck from a respected local businessman. Crane looked around the platform, at his own men backing away, at the crowd's mounting fury, at the judge who'd gone very pale and very quiet near the platform steps, at Whitcomb still holding the ledgers, at Marin standing steady where a month ago she'd stood bound and silent on a different platform entirely, and something in his face finally cracked all the way through. "You ungrateful, every one of you owes me," he snarled at the crowd, voice raw now, stripped of its earlier polish. "Half this county would have lost everything to drought or debt collectors twice as ruthless as me if I hadn't stepped in. I built this. I held this whole territory together while the rest of you sat scared in your houses. You held it together by taking it apart, piece by piece, family by family," Marin said, and the platform went quiet enough to hear her clearly even though she wasn't shouting. "You didn't save this county. You just made sure everyone was too afraid to notice you were eating it." Crane lunged for her then, not a calculated move, not the careful businessman who'd built an empire on patience and intimidation, but something raw and cornered, a man who'd lost control of a moment for the first time in years and reacted the only way left to him. Coulter was faster. He didn't draw his gun. He simply stepped into Crane's path and put him down with a single hard blow, the kind of move that came from a man who'd learned violence as a tool of last resort and knew exactly how much force a situation actually required. Crane hit the platform boards hard, the wind driven out of him, and didn't get up right away. The judge, finally finding his voice, finally finding the courage that 300 witnesses had apparently lent him, stepped forward. "I'll need those ledgers," he said to Whitcomb, voice unsteady but resolved. "And statements. From all of you who've got stories to tell." He looked down at Crane, still sprawled on the platform boards, and something hard settled into his expression. "Mr. Crane, I think you and I need to have a very long conversation, and I don't believe it's going to end the way you're used to conversations with me ending." The crowd's noise had shifted now from confused murmur to something closer to a roar. Not violence, not yet, but the unmistakable sound of people who'd spent years being quiet finally finding they didn't have to be anymore. Marin stood on the platform amid the chaos, Coulter beside her, breathing hard, and looked out at 300 faces that had watched her get bought like property a month ago and were now watching her tear down the man who'd nearly owned her. "It's not over," Coulter said quietly, close enough only she could hear. "Crane's got friends in places this crowd can't reach. The judge, the ledgers. It's a start, but it's not the end of this." "I know," Marin said, "but it's the first time since my father died that it feels like the end might actually be coming." Behind them, two of Crane's own former hired men were helping the territorial judge restrain him, while ranchers who'd spent years staying quiet pressed forward with stories of their own, each one chipping another piece off the wall of fear Crane had spent a decade building around Larkspur County. The auction grounds, built for buying and selling cattle, had become something else entirely that afternoon, a place where an entire county finally stopped looking away. Word traveled faster than any of them expected. By the time Marin and Coulter made it back to Cedar Hollow 4 days later, the story of what happened at the Larkspur auction had already outrun them, carried by ranchers heading home in every direction, told and retold until it had taken on the shape of something almost mythic. The woman who'd been sold on a platform standing up on another platform to bring her buyer's enemy down in front of 300 witnesses. The town looked different riding in. Marin noticed it before she could name it, something in the way people stood in their doorways now, watching the road instead of avoiding it, like Cedar Hollow had been holding its breath for years and had finally remembered how to exhale. Sheriff Daly was the first to meet them at the edge of town, and Marin tensed on instinct, old fear rising fast before she made herself remember she wasn't the same woman who'd stood bound on that platform a month ago. But Daly didn't reach for anything. He stood in the road with his hat in his hands, looking older than she remembered, looking like a man who'd spent a long 4 days reckoning with every moment he'd chosen silence over decency. "Heard what happened at Larkspur," he said. "Whole territory's heard by now." "Then you know about the ledgers," Coulter said, voice flat, giving the man nothing to work with yet. "I know the judge there sent word ahead. I know there's a marshal riding in from the territorial capital end of the week to start sorting through every land claim Crane's had a hand in over the past decade." Daly's jaw worked. I know I should have done something a long time before this. Marin's standing on that auction block, and I just stood there and watched it happen because Crane had enough on me, enough threats hanging over my badge, that I told myself there wasn't anything I could do. There's always something a man can do, Marin said. You just have to decide it's worth more than staying comfortable. Daly nodded slowly, like the words cost him something to hear. I'm not asking forgiveness. Don't reckon I've earned it. But I am turning in evidence of my own. Papers Crane had me sign off on, knowing they weren't right. Threats he made plain enough I could repeat them to that marshal word for word. If it helps bury what he's done, I'll give every bit of it. Coulter studied him for a long moment. That's a start, he said. Whether it's enough is between you and that marshal, not us. They rode on into town, past faces that watched them now with something closer to gratitude than the wary blankness Marin remembered, and stopped finally outside what used to be the feed store. The same building, the same platform out front where everything had started, though someone had already torn the wooden structure half apart, like the town itself couldn't stand to look at it intact any longer. Crane's grand house sat at the edge of town, the largest building for 30 miles, and even from a distance Marin could see the activity around it. Wagons, men in territorial uniforms, the particular controlled chaos of an investigation already underway. They moved fast, she said. Money like Crane's doesn't stay tied up forever without somebody official paying attention, Coulter said. Once the marshal's office got word there might be a decade of fraud sitting behind those forged ledgers, they weren't going to wait around for him to clean house first. They found the marshal, a lean, gray-haired man named Garrett Holt, who'd ridden 3 days straight once Larkspur's judge sent word. Standing in the front room of Crane's house, surrounded by stacks of paperwork his deputies were sorting into careful piles. Miss Ashcroft, he said, when Marin and Coulter were shown in, and there was something almost formal in the way he said it, like he was already treating her as a witness whose word would matter in whatever followed. I understand you and Mr. Vance here are largely responsible for this coming to light. We had help, Marin said. A lot of it. People who finally found the nerve to talk. That's usually how these things go, Holt said. One person stops being afraid, and it gives everybody else permission to stop too. He gestured at the paperwork around him. We found enough here to keep territorial courts busy for a year. Forged debts going back 9 years. At least 14 ranches we can already confirm were seized on fraudulent paper. Probably more once we finish sorting. 14, Coulter repeated, low. That we've confirmed. Could be more. Holt's mouth tightened. Your father's claim is one of the clearest, Miss Ashcroft. The signature doesn't match anything else in his hand, not even close. And we found correspondence between Crane and his lawyer discussing how to make a forged debt look convincing enough to hold up if anyone questioned it. They didn't expect anyone would. Most people didn't. Marin stood very still, hearing it laid out plain like that. Not suspicion anymore, not the careful, frightened wondering she'd carried for 8 months, but confirmation, written in Crane's own hired hand, that her father had been murdered for land, his death dressed up as accident, his name forged onto a debt that never existed. Where is he? She asked. Crane. Holding cell 3 towns over until the territorial court's ready to try him properly. Holt studied her face carefully. You want to see him? No, Marin said, and was surprised by how easily the word came, how little she actually wanted to look at Silas Crane's face again. I just wanted to know he's not walking free somewhere, deciding how to come back at us. He's not walking anywhere for a long while, Holt said. Between the fraud, the seized land, and what's coming out about that accident with your father, territorial law doesn't go easy on men who hire other men to make a death look natural. Something in Marin's chest, wound tight for 8 months, finally loosened. Not into relief, exactly. Relief felt too small a word for it, but into something like the first deep breath after holding her air too long. The weeks that followed were slower, less dramatic than the auction, but in their own way harder, the long, grinding work of rebuilding what Crane had spent years tearing apart. The 14 confirmed families began returning, some from towns they'd fled to, others from relatives' houses where they'd been living crowded and uncertain since losing their land. Marin met most of them as the territorial court worked through each claim, the Pruitts, weathered and wary but slowly unclenching as the marshal's office confirmed their water rights had been stolen, not forfeited. The Delgados, whose barn fire turned out, under careful investigation, to have been set deliberately by men on Crane's payroll, evidence buried until now under the same fear that had kept everyone quiet for years. "I don't know how to thank you," Mrs. Delgado told her, the day the family's deed was formally returned, her voice thick with an emotion that didn't have an easy name. We'd given up. We'd told ourselves it was just bad luck. The fire, losing everything. We didn't let ourselves believe somebody had done it on purpose, because believing that meant believing nobody was ever going to make it right. "You don't need to thank me," Marin said. "You just need to keep what's yours and make sure nobody ever takes it from you again without a fight." It wasn't always that clean. Some families didn't want their land back so much as they wanted the years returned to them, the time spent scraping by somewhere unfamiliar, the children who'd grown up displaced and uncertain. Marin learned slowly that justice didn't erase what had already happened. It just made sure it stopped happening to the next family in line. Her own ranch took longer to reclaim than most, tangled up in the particular cruelty of Crane having held the deed personally rather than selling it off the way he had with some of the others. The territorial court moved through the paperwork with the same careful thoroughness as everything else, and by the time the final seal was stamped returning the Ashcroft land to her name, 6 weeks had passed since the auction at Larkspur. Coulter rode out with her the day she finally walked the property again. The house standing empty and dust-covered, locks long since changed back, her father's belongings still sitting where Crane's men had left them after clearing her out months before. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she could make herself step inside. "You don't have to do this today," Coulter said quietly behind her. "Nobody's forcing a deadline on grief." "I know." She breathed out slow. "I think I need to, though. I've spent so long either running from what happened here or fighting to fix it that I never actually let myself just stand in it and feel what it cost." She walked through the house room by room, touching things. Her father's chair by the window, still angled the way he always left it. A shelf of books he'd read to her as a girl, dust thick on their spines. The kitchen table where they'd eaten 1,000 ordinary meals she hadn't known to treasure until they stopped. In her father's room, she found a small wooden box tucked beneath a loose floorboard, the same kind of hiding place Whitcomb had used for his ledgers, like the whole territory had learned the same hard lesson about what needed protecting from men like Crane. Inside were letters, her father's handwriting, careful and familiar, nothing like the trembling forgery on Crane's debt papers, documenting his own suspicions in the months before he died. Notes about strange visits from Crane's associates. A draft of a letter to the territorial governor he'd apparently never finished, raising concerns about land seizures happening across the county that he'd started to notice a pattern in. "He knew," Marin said quietly, reading through the pages with hands that shook now for an entirely different reason than fear. He was already trying to do something about it before Crane, before whatever happened on that ride. Coulter read over her shoulder, his expression hardening. He was building a case, same as we did. Just slower, just alone, without anybody backing him up. He looked at her. "That's likely why Crane moved when he did. Your father wasn't just one more name to seize land from. He was a threat to the whole operation." Marin held the letters for a long time. Grief and a strange, fierce pride tangled together in her chest. Her father hadn't died by accident, and he hadn't died doing nothing. He'd died trying, the same way she'd nearly given up trying a dozen times over the past 2 months. And hadn't, because some part of her, even without knowing these letters existed, had carried forward exactly what he'd started. "I want these included in the court record," she said finally, "not to add more charges against Crane. The man's already facing enough to never see open land again. I want it on record because he deserves to be remembered as someone who saw what was happening and tried to stop it, not just as another name on a forged debt." "We'll make sure of it," Coulter said. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic, after everything that led to it. Crane sitting in a territorial courtroom 3 towns over, stripped of the polish and command that had once made grown men go quiet in his presence, facing charge after charge read aloud by a prosecutor working through evidence thick enough to fill 3 tables. Marin testified. So did Whitcomb, finally standing in open daylight under his own name again, the false beard and the years of hiding finally unnecessary. So did a dozen others, ranchers, former employees, even 2 of Crane's hired men who'd walked away at Larkspur and decided, in the weeks since, that testifying honestly was worth more than whatever loyalty they'd once owed a man who'd never actually been loyal to anyone but himself. Sheriff Daly testified too, laying out his own complicity with a bluntness that surprised Marin, not seeking sympathy, just stating plainly what he'd done and why, and accepting that the territorial court would decide what that cost him. Crane didn't speak much in his own defense. What little he did say carried the same cornered, bitter edge he'd shown at the auction platform, insisting even now that he'd held the county together, that without his particular brand of control, everyone in it would have fallen apart on their own. Nobody in the courtroom seemed inclined to believe him anymore. The verdict, when it came, wasn't satisfying in the way Marin had imagined it might be during the worst of those 8 months. No flash of triumph, no sudden lightness, just a long sentence. Every seized property formally returned, restitution ordered that would take years to fully pay out, and Silas Crane led from the courtroom in chains that would keep him from ever standing on another platform deciding who got bought and who got to walk free. "How do you feel?" Coulter asked, once they were outside. The courthouse steps crowded with the families who'd come to watch the end of it. Marin considered the question honestly before answering. "Tired," she said. "Relieved. Sad in a way I didn't expect. Not for him, never for him, but for everything it cost to get here. My father. 2 years of Whitcomb's life spent hiding. 14 families who lost time they're never getting back." She looked at Coulter, at the steady, careful man who'd ridden into the worst day of her life and refused to let it stay that way. "But mostly I feel like I can finally stop fighting and start actually living. I haven't felt that in a long time." "What happens now?" he asked. "Now that it's over." "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I know I want to do something with the ranch beyond just having it back. Something that means more than just mine again." She glanced toward the families still gathered on the courthouse steps, the children who'd grown up, displaced, finally watching their parents stand a little straighter. "I keep thinking about what it felt like, having nowhere to go that wasn't owned by somebody else. I don't want that to be true for anyone else, not if I can help it." Coulter was quiet for a moment, watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not the careful wariness of the stranger who'd ridden into Cedar Hollow 2 months ago, but something warmer, something that had grown slow and steady the same way her courage had. "Whatever you build," he said, "I'd like to be there for it, if that's something you want." Marin looked at him, at the man who'd bought her freedom for $1,000 and then spent 2 months teaching her she'd never actually needed buying, that the freedom had been hers to claim all along, that he'd simply made sure nobody stood in her way of claiming it. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like that more than almost anything." Behind them, Cedar Hollow and Larkspur and a dozen other towns scattered across the territory were beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to remember what it felt like to stand together instead of standing afraid. Not because Crane was gone, exactly, but because enough people had finally watched what happened when somebody refused to stay quiet, and decided that was a lesson worth carrying forward long after the courthouse doors closed behind him for the last time. Spring came slow to the territory that year, the way it always did, frost lingering stubborn in the mornings, even as the days stretched longer. Marin had stopped marking time by the trial, by the auction, by any of it. She'd started marking it instead by what the ranch needed. Fences mended, fields turned, a roof patched before the rains came hard in April. It had been 8 months since the courthouse steps, since Crane had been led away in chains, and the Ashcroft Ranch looked nothing like the dust-covered, locked-up house she'd walked back into that first day. Word had spread, slow and then faster, the way word always traveled once people decided a thing was worth talking about. A woman who'd been sold on an auction block and clawed her own freedom back, now rebuilding her father's land into something other than just a ranch. A place for women who'd run out of places to go. Women who'd been promised to men they didn't choose, or thrown out by families that decided they were more burden than blood, or simply left with nowhere else standing when everything else they'd known fell apart. The first to arrive had been a girl no older than 16, half-starved, with a story Marin recognized in pieces of her own. A guardian who'd decided a debt was easier to collect in flesh than coin. Marin hadn't asked many questions that first night. She'd just made up a bed and let the girl sleep without anybody watching the door. By spring, there were 11 women living on the ranch in various states of rebuilding, some working the land alongside her, learning the same things Coulter had once patiently taught Marin, others simply resting, healing from things that didn't mend as fast as fences did. 3 children ran underfoot most mornings. sons and daughters of women who'd arrived with nothing but the clothes they were wearing and whatever courage it had taken to leave. "You've got more hands than the house has room for," Coulter said one morning, watching from the porch as Marin walked the new barn extension with one of the older women, discussing where to put another set of stalls. "Then we build more room," Marin said, climbing the porch steps to join him, accepting the cup of coffee he handed her without being asked. An old habit by now, comfortable in the particular way only two people who'd survived something together could be comfortable. "Whitcomb sent word last week. Says there's lumber coming cheap from a mill 2 counties over, on account of the owner being one of the families that got their land back. Says he won't take Crane's old customers' business anymore on principle, so he's looking for new ones who deserve a fair price." Coulter smiled, the easy, unguarded kind that had become more frequent over the months, a far cry from the careful, controlled man who'd ridden into Cedar Hollow with $1,000 and a debt to an old grief he'd never quite said out loud again. "Whitcomb's done well for himself, considering where he started." "We all have," Marin said quietly. She wasn't being modest. The ranch had become something neither of them had fully planned, growing organic and a little chaotic the way real things tended to. Nothing like the smooth, easy vision she might have sketched out on paper if she'd sat down and tried. There'd been setbacks, a woman who'd arrived terrified and left just as suddenly 2 weeks later, unable to trust that the safety was real, that nobody was going to demand payment for it eventually. A fire in the old smokehouse that took a week to fully extinguish the damage from an accident this time. Nothing sinister, just bad luck and a dropped lantern, but it had cost them supplies they could ill afford to lose. Money was tight more often than not. The ranch's income from cattle and crops stretched thin across mouths that kept growing in number. But it was real. That was the thing Marin had come to understand, slow and hard-won, in the months since the trial, that real things didn't arrive finished and polished. They arrived rough, full of mistakes, built one uncertain decision at a time by people who were imperfect and frightened, and trying anyway. Cedar Hollow itself had changed too, though slower, and not without its own stumbling. The town had elected a new sheriff that winter, a quiet, steady woman named Iris Calloway, who'd lost her own family's land to one of Crane's forged debts years back, and had spent the months since the trial working through territorial law training with a determination that surprised everyone who remembered her as the soft-spoken seamstress she'd been before. Daly had resigned his badge the same week the verdict came down against Crane, choosing exile from public office over the cost of staying, though he'd stayed in town, working a small plot of land at its edge, quiet and mostly kept to himself, carrying the weight of his old silence in a way that Marin suspected he'd never fully set down. She didn't hate him for it. She thought she might in the early months, but somewhere along the way, maybe building the ranch, maybe watching her own fear slowly transform into something steadier, she'd let that particular grudge go. Daly had been afraid, same as half the town had been afraid, same as she herself had been afraid before Coulter rode into the square that day. Fear made people complicit in ways that didn't excuse anything, but understanding it, at least, kept her from carrying it as a weight of her own. "You ever think about what would have happened?" she asked Coulter one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch steps the way they often did after the day's work wound down. "If you hadn't ridden into town that morning?" Coulter was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slow in his hands. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "Wonder if Crane would still be standing, still buying up land, still convincing an entire county that fear was just the natural cost of living somewhere with men like him in charge." "I used to think you saved me," Marin said. "I don't think that anymore. I think you just made it possible for me to save myself. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one in the moment." "What's the difference?" Coulter asked, genuinely curious, the way he still sometimes was about the things she'd come to understand that he hadn't quite worked through himself. "Saving somebody makes them dependent on the person who did the saving," Marin said. "What you did was different. You stood between me and the worst of it long enough that I had room to figure out I had strength of my own. You didn't carry me through any of it. You just made sure I didn't have to face it completely alone while I learned to carry myself." Coulter was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the ranch spread before them, the new barn extension, the women working the fields in the long evening light, the children chasing each other between the fence posts with the particular unguarded laughter of kids who finally felt safe enough to be loud. "My sister never got that chance," he said finally, voice rough in a way it rarely was. Nobody stood between her and the worst of it. Nobody gave her room to figure out her own strength, because the men around her made sure she never had room to discover it existed. He looked at Marin. Watching you build this, watching you turn the worst day of your life into something that's saving other people from their own worst days, it doesn't undo what happened to her. Nothing ever will. But it means something, watching it happen anyway. It means the story doesn't have to end the same way every time. Marin reached over and took his hand, rough and weathered from years of work. Neither of them had been born into so much as forced to learn, and held it without saying anything for a while, because some things didn't need more words layered onto them. The wedding, when it finally happened that autumn, was small and unglamorous in the way both of them had quietly agreed they preferred. No grand ceremony in town, no audience of curious onlookers treating it as the final chapter of a story they'd all watched unfold from a careful distance. Just the ranch, the women and children who'd come to call it home, Whitcomb traveling in from 2 counties over with a gift of fine paper and ink he said Marin would understand once she saw it, and Sheriff Calloway standing witness with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd watched justice actually take root somewhere instead of just being promised and abandoned. Marin wore her mother's dress, found packed away in the same trunk where she'd discovered her father's letters, mended where moths had gotten to the hem, and she thought, standing in it, that her parents would have recognized very little about the woman she'd become since the morning Crane dragged her onto that platform, and that they would have been proud of every bit of the difference. "Any words for the occasion?" Whitcomb asked afterward, when the small gathering had settled into the easy, unstructured warmth of people sharing food and stories on a long autumn evening, children weaving between the adults' legs, lanterns lit against the gathering dark. Marin considered the question seriously, the way she'd learned to consider most things since the auction, not rushing toward an easy answer, weighing instead what was actually true. "I used to think belonging was something other people decided for you," she said finally, loud enough for the gathered group to hear, though she hadn't intended it as a speech. "Crane decided I belonged to a debt that wasn't even real. My guardian decided I belonged to whoever paid for me. For a long time, I thought that was just how the world worked, that some people got to decide where you belonged, and the rest of us just had to live inside whatever decision got made." She looked around at the faces gathered there, women who'd arrived with nothing, children who'd grown up displaced and frightened and were now simply children again, Coulter beside her with the particular stillness he carried when he was listening hardest. "I don't believe that anymore," she said. "Belonging isn't something handed to you, and it's not something anybody else gets to take away, no matter how much money or power they think they have. It's something you build every single day through what you choose to do and who you choose to stand beside. This ranch doesn't belong to me because some piece of paper says so. It belongs to all of us because we built it together, out of nothing. Out of fear, we decided to stop carrying alone." She felt Coulter's hand find hers, steady, the same steady it had been since the moment he'd cut the rope from her wrists on a platform in Cedar Hollow that felt now like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. "I don't have some grand lesson to leave anybody with," she said. "I just know that the worst day of my life turned into this, eventually, because somebody decided not to look away, and because once I had room to stop being afraid, I decided I wasn't interested in looking away either. That's not a miracle. It's just what happens when enough people decide fear isn't worth more than doing the right thing, even when the right thing is hard, even when it might cost you everything." The gathering was quiet for a moment after that, the particular quiet of people sitting with something true, before the children's laughter broke it again, chasing fireflies into the deepening dark, and the evening folded back into warmth and easy conversation. Years later, when people in the territory told the story of Cedar Hollow and the auction that started a war, they tended to focus on the dramatic parts, the gunfight at the ranch, the confrontation at Larkspur, Crane's empire collapsing in front of 300 witnesses. Those parts made for good telling, the kind of story passed down at gatherings and around fires, growing a little taller with each retelling the way stories tend to. But Marin, when she told it to the children who grew up on the ranch, her own, eventually, 2 of them, alongside the dozen others who passed through over the years on their way to lives that finally belonged to them, always tried to tell the quieter parts too. The 3 weeks of falling off horses before she learned to ride, the bruised, uncertain feeling of holding a rifle for the first time, the long nights of fear before the auction at Larkspur, when she hadn't known if the plan would work, when she'd been every bit as terrified as she'd been standing on that first platform, just terrified in a direction that finally felt like it was hers to choose. Courage isn't not being scared, she told them, more than once, sitting on the porch in the long evening light that had become the ranch's quietest, most treasured hour. I was scared the whole time, every single part of it. Courage is just deciding the thing you're scared of isn't bigger than the thing you're fighting for. Coulter never did fully shed the watchfulness that had marked him since his sister's death, that careful awareness of a man who'd learned the cost of looking away too late once and never wanted to risk it again. But the ranch had softened something in him too, over the years. The lonely drifting cowboy who'd ridden into Cedar Hollow with nothing but a horse, a debt to an old grief, and $1,000 he'd been saving for reasons even he hadn't fully understood at the time, had become, slowly and without much ceremony, a man who belonged somewhere, who had people who'd notice if he didn't come home at night, who had built, alongside a woman he'd once paid to free rather than to own, something neither of them could have imagined standing in that dusty square the morning it all began. The auction platform in Cedar Hollow's square was long gone by then, torn apart the week after Crane's trial and never rebuilt. The wood used instead for a community schoolhouse the town raised together that following spring, a small, deliberate choice, turning the place where a woman had once been sold like property into a place where children learned to read and ask questions and grow up believing the world owed them more than silent fear. Marin liked to think her father would have approved of that particular justice, the kind that didn't just punish what was wrong, but built something better in its place. The ranch kept growing, kept taking in women who needed somewhere safe to land, kept teaching them, the way Coulter had once taught her, that survival and living were two very different things, and that the difference between them was usually just a matter of someone, somewhere, refusing to let fear have the final say. Not every story that arrived on the ranch ended easy. Some women left and never found their footing elsewhere. Some children carried scars that healing couldn't fully smooth over no matter how much time and safety surrounded them. Myra never pretended otherwise and never dressed the work up as more triumphant than it actually was. It was hard, unglamorous, daily work, full of setbacks and slow progress and small victories that didn't always feel like enough in the moment. But it was real. And it was theirs. And on quiet evenings, watching the lanterns light up across a ranch that had once stood empty and locked, full, now of voices and laughter and the particular noise of people building lives they'd chosen for themselves, Marin understood that this, not the gunfights, not the courtroom verdict, not even the dramatic confrontation at Larkspur, was the actual ending of the story that had started the day a stranger rode into a square and refused to let her be sold. This was what freedom actually looked like once you got past the fighting for it. Not a single triumphant moment, but years of ordinary days built one choice at a time by people who'd decided that belonging was something worth building together, no matter how long it took or how much it cost to get there. Cedar Hollow itself had changed too, though slower, and not without its own stumbling. The town had elected a new sheriff that winter, a quiet, steady woman named Iris Calloway, who'd lost her own family's land to one of Crane's forged debts years back, and had spent the months since the trial working through territorial law training with a determination that surprised everyone who remembered her as the soft-spoken seamstress she'd been before. Daly had resigned his badge the same week the verdict came down against Crane, choosing exile from public office over the cost of staying, though he'd stayed in town, working a small plot of land at its edge, quiet and mostly kept to himself, carrying the weight of his old silence in a way that Marin suspected he'd never fully set down. She didn't hate him for it. She'd thought she might in the early months, but somewhere along the way, maybe building the ranch, maybe watching her own fear slowly transform into something steadier, she'd let that particular grudge go. Daly had been afraid, same as half the town had been afraid, same as she herself had been afraid, before Coulter rode into the square that day. Fear made people complicit in ways that didn't excuse anything, but understanding it, at least, kept her from carrying it as a weight of her own. "You ever think about what would have happened?" she asked Coulter one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch steps the way they often did after the day's work wound down. "If you hadn't ridden into town that morning?" Coulter was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slow in his hands. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "Wonder if Crane would still be standing, still buying up land, still convincing an entire county that fear was just the natural cost of living somewhere with men like him in charge. "I used to think you saved me," Marin said. "I don't think that anymore. I think you just made it possible for me to save myself. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one in the moment." "What's the difference?" Coulter asked, genuinely curious, the way he still sometimes was about the things she'd come to understand that he hadn't quite worked through himself. "Saving somebody makes them dependent on the person who did the saving," Marin said. "What you did was different. You stood between me and the worst of it long enough that I had room to figure out I had strength of my own. You didn't carry me through any of it. You just made sure I didn't have to face it completely alone while I learned to carry myself." Coulter was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the ranch spread before them. The new barn extension, the women working the fields in the long evening light, the children chasing each other between the fence posts with the particular unguarded laughter of kids who finally felt safe enough to be loud. "My sister never got that chance," he said finally, voice rough in a way it rarely was. "Nobody stood between her and the worst of it. Nobody gave her room to figure out her own strength, because the men around her made sure she never had room to discover it existed." He looked at Marin. "Watching you build this, watching you turn the worst day of your life into something that's saving other people from their own worst days, it doesn't undo what happened to her. Nothing ever will. But it means something, watching it happen anyway. It means the story doesn't have to end the same way every time." Marin reached over and took his hand, rough and weathered from years of work. Neither of them had been born into so much as forced to learn, and held it without saying anything for a while, because some things didn't need more words layered onto them. The wedding, when it finally happened that autumn, was small and unglamorous in the way both of them had quietly agreed they preferred. No grand ceremony in town, no audience of curious onlookers treating it as the final chapter of a story they'd all watched unfold from a careful distance. Just the ranch, the women and children who'd come to call it home. Whitcomb traveling in from 2 counties over with a gift of fine paper and ink he said Marin would understand once she saw it, and Sheriff Calloway standing witness with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd watched justice actually take root somewhere instead of just being promised and abandoned. Marin wore her mother's dress, found packed away in the same trunk where she'd discovered her father's letters, mended where moths had gotten to the hem, and she thought, standing in it, that her parents would have recognized very little about the woman she'd become since the morning Crane dragged her onto that platform, and that they would have been proud of every bit of the difference. "Any words for the occasion?" Whitcomb asked afterward, when the small gathering had settled into the easy, unstructured warmth of people sharing food and stories on a long autumn evening, children weaving between the adults' legs, lanterns lit against the gathering dark. Marin considered the question seriously, the way she'd learned to consider most things since the auction, not rushing toward an easy answer, weighing instead what was actually true. "I used to think belonging was something other people decided for you," she said finally, loud enough for the gathered group to hear, though she hadn't intended it as a speech. "Crane decided I belonged to a debt that wasn't even real. My guardian decided I belonged to whoever paid for me. For a long time, I thought that was just how the world worked, that some people got to decide where you belonged, and the rest of us just had to live inside whatever decision got made." She looked around at the faces gathered there, women who'd arrived with nothing, children who'd grown up displaced and frightened, and were now simply children again, Coulter beside her with the particular stillness he carried when he was listening hardest. "I don't believe that anymore," she said. "Belonging isn't something handed to you, and it's not something anybody else gets to take away, no matter how much money or power they think they have. It's something you build every single day through what you choose to do and who you choose to stand beside. This ranch doesn't belong to me because some piece of paper says so. It belongs to all of us because we built it together, out of nothing. Out of fear, we decided to stop carrying alone." She felt Coulter's hand find hers steady, the same steady it had been since the moment he'd cut the rope from her wrists on a platform in Cedar Hollow that felt now like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. "I don't have some grand lesson to leave anybody with," she said. "I just know that the worst day of my life turned into this, eventually, because somebody decided not to look away, and because once I had room to stop being afraid, I decided I wasn't interested in looking away either. That's not a miracle. It's just what happens when enough people decide fear isn't worth more than doing the right thing, even when the right thing is hard, even when it might cost you everything." The gathering was quiet for a moment after that, the particular quiet of people sitting with something true, before the children's laughter broke it again, chasing fireflies into the deepening dark, and the evening folded back into warmth and easy conversation. Years later, when people in the territory told the story of Cedar Hollow and the auction that started a war, they tended to focus on the dramatic parts: the gunfight at the ranch, the confrontation at Larkspur, Crane's empire collapsing in front of 300 witnesses. Those parts made for good telling, the kind of story passed down at gatherings and around fires, growing a little taller with each retelling the way stories tend to. But Marin, when she told it to the children who grew up on the ranch, her own, eventually, 2 of them, alongside the dozen others who passed through over the years on their way to lives that finally belonged to them, always tried to tell the quieter parts too, the 3 weeks of falling off horses before she learned to ride, the bruised, uncertain feeling of holding a rifle for the first time, the long nights of fear before the auction at Larkspur, when she hadn't known if the plan would work, when she'd been every bit as terrified as she'd been standing on that first platform, just terrified in a direction that finally felt like it was hers to choose. Courage isn't not being scared, she told them more than once, sitting on the porch in the long evening light that had become the ranch's quietest, most treasured hour. I was scared the whole time, every single part of it. Courage is just deciding the thing you're scared of isn't bigger than the thing you're fighting for. Coulter never did fully shed the watchfulness that had marked him since his sister's death, that careful awareness of a man who'd learned the cost of looking away too late once and never wanted to risk it again. But the ranch had softened something in him too, over the years. The lonely, drifting cowboy who'd ridden into Cedar Hollow with nothing but a horse, a debt to an old grief, and $1,000 he'd been saving for reasons even he hadn't fully understood at the time, had become, slowly and without much ceremony, a man who belonged somewhere, who had people who'd notice if he didn't come home at night, who had built, alongside a woman he'd once paid to free rather than to own, something neither of them could have imagined standing in that dusty square the morning it all began. The auction platform in Cedar Hollow Square was long gone by then, torn apart the week after Crane's trial, and never rebuilt. The wood used instead for a community schoolhouse the town raised together that following spring. A small, deliberate choice, turning the place where a woman had once been sold like property into a place where children learned to read and ask questions and grow up believing the world owed them more than silent fear. Marin liked to think her father would have approved of that particular justice, the kind that didn't just punish what was wrong, but built something better in its place. The ranch kept growing, kept taking in women who needed somewhere safe to land, kept teaching them, the way Coulter had once taught her, that survival and living were 2 very different things, and that the difference between them was usually just a matter of someone, somewhere, refusing to let fear have the final say. Not every story that arrived on the ranch ended easy. Some women left and never found their footing elsewhere. Some children carried scars that healing couldn't fully smooth over no matter how much time and safety surrounded them. Marin never pretended otherwise, never dressed the work up as more triumphant than it actually was. It was hard, unglamorous, daily work, full of setbacks and slow progress, and small victories that didn't always feel like enough in the moment. But it was real, and it was theirs. And on quiet evenings, watching the lanterns light up across a ranch that had once stood empty and locked, full now of voices and laughter and the particular noise of people building lives they'd chosen for themselves, Marin understood that this, not the gunfights, not the courtroom verdict, not even the dramatic confrontation at Larkspur, was the actual ending of the story that had started the day a stranger rode into a square and refused to let her be sold. This was what freedom actually looked like, once you got past the fighting for it. Not a single triumphant moment, but years of ordinary days built one choice at a time by people who decided that belonging was something worth building together, no matter how long it took or how much it cost to get there.